Hello, I'm Melissa Reader. Welcome to Agehood, the podcast for midlifers like you, like me, who are quietly carrying it all, caring for increasingly elderly parents, in-laws too, adult kids, work, relationships, finances, and our own next chapter. If that sounds a little like you, well, you are in your agehood, and it's time we talked about it. There aren't that many people that could say that they have changed the way that thousands of people understand the last stage of life. But today's guest, she really can. Dr. Kathryn Mannix is a palliative care physician. She's a best-selling author and a global advocate for bringing death back into the realm of ordinary conversations. In my view, everyone needs a little bit more of Kathryn's warmth and wisdom in their lives. But today, we're going to bring it to your ears. Across her 30-year career, Kathryn has supported thousands of people and their loved ones through the final days and the final hours of life. She's written quite a few books, and I hear there's a third on the way. But check out the first two, With the End in Mind and Listen. They gently but powerfully help us dismantle the fear and the mystery that surrounds end of life and dying, and it helps us to replace silence with tenderness, avoidance with honesty, and panic with a little more presence. In our episode today, Kathryn explains what actually happens when a person dies, physically and emotionally. We don't really get many opportunities to learn about that, and why our imaginations are often far more frightening than the reality. We talk together about what it means to tend to grief rather than try and fix it, how to support someone that you love through their final life stages, and what can happen when families are unprepared for this because no one knows how to talk about it or when. Kathryn's going to give us a masterclass in how to have some of those tender conversations that, so many of us tend to avoid. So if you're caring for someone, you've got this idea of a conversation that you think you might need to have, please listen in. You're going to learn a lot in today's conversation, and we both hope it gives you just that bit more comfort and courage to talk to the people in your life. Dr. Kathryn Mannix, welcome to Agehood.
Thank you very much. How lovely to be with you.
Isn't it lovely? We've had a cup of tea and a chat, and we're here in the York countryside, and who would have thought we'd pull this off? Managed to get some time together while I was over in the UK.
We've done it. It's raining, just for your proper British summer welcome.
Yes, it's very, very, very quintessentially UK. Kathryn, you are arguably the UK's leading voice on the way people are experiencing the last stages of life, and you have done so much to publicly campaign about better care and better conversations. It is just such a privilege to be having this chat with you, so I'm so grateful that you've made the time. We've done a bit of work together already, haven't we, over the last couple of years, through the work of Violet. And, I imagine there are going to be a lot of listeners to Agehood who aren't familiar with your work as yet. So maybe we start off by telling us a little bit about how you became so passionate about this stage of a person's life.
Well, thank you for having me for that very, very kind introduction. I was a palliative care doctor. I worked in palliative care in the UK for 30 years. And over that period of time, although I worked in hospices, I also worked in people's own homes with community palliative care teams. And largely for the latter part of my career in hospitals as part of a liaison palliative care service. So I think the first important thing to say to everybody who's listening is palliative care is about dying. That you don't have to be dying to meet the palliative care team. The palliative care team are there to help restabilize and rebalance the joy of living for you, living the best way you can with whatever illness you're currently suffering from. But it is true that we meet a lot of people who are in the later stages of living and who are beginning to die from the illnesses that they have, because that's when the symptom challenges start and that's when they need us. And so it means that I spent those 30 years alongside people who were reaching the end of their lives. I could see how precious and important that time was for people. And I could see how well it can be lived at home and how difficult it can be to carry on caring for what maybe a family thought would be a week or several, and it turns into months or maybe years. So you're both sides of the being at home coin, the joy of being in your own place, but also how hard it can be to become less able to do things and more we need. But also meeting people in hospital who generally, hospital is not anybody's favourite place.
Yeah.
It's not very private. It's difficult to have those really important conversations with people who matter most to us. You're surrounded by people who are sick. Hospital is a really bad place for catching illnesses that other people have brought into the hospital with them. So you come in with one problem and you end up with several that you acquired while you were there. So
You're generally preoccupied with when you get out of hospital.
it's how to get home, see escape in life.
That's right.
And yet we know that around half of people, despite our campaign to improve it in Australia and in the UK, it's different in different parts of both of our countries, that there are more people dying in hospital than the number of people who would like to live that last part of their lives in hospital. And so that made me feel that we could do better. We could do better at this. And that we need to see the last part of living as a part of living and not just give it this badge dying, which doesn't really tell us very much about it. And it doesn't help every day to be a day to be embraced and lived through and enjoyed as much as possible. So we've stopped talking about it. So it's become a little bit impolite, even, I think, to have conversations about it. Just to say the word. And if we can't talk about it, then how can we organise ourselves for it?
For everybody listening, it's been my view since I have been talking with and knowing Kathryn that everybody out there needs a little more of the wisdom of Dr. Kathryn Mannix in their ears and in their lives. So you're going to really enjoy this conversation. And I think that's a really interesting point because of the fear and the stigma and the avoidance. We don't tend to think about this as a stage of life like we think about all the other stages of life. We tend to A, not think about it, and then B, think of the event of someone's death. But there's a whole lot of experience and richness and love and decision making and complexity, in the last couple of years of someone's life, isn't it? But we just don't do a good job of thinking about that or talking about it or having a plan in place.
No, it's so interesting meeting people in hospital and, they've had an illness that we know is life-limiting and they've had it for a long time, and they can describe how, 2 years ago I was driving my car and I was growing my vegetables, or I was pushing a trolley around the supermarket, and this year I can hardly get out of my house, and for the last few weeks sometimes it's a struggle even to get out of bed. So they're able to describe their own trajectory, or family can describe the trajectory of a sick person. And yet they almost stop the movie at that point and don't think about, if this trajectory continues, where is it going?
And frailty in itself is a life-limiting illness, isn't it? That, again, we don't tend to recognise. It's not something that is formally diagnosed, but as we really experience an ageing population, both in the UK and in Australia and many other parts of the world, helping families to recognise frailty as one of those life-limiting conditions is a big part of this.
Oh, you're so right. And one of the things that I come across over and over again is that people want to live for a longer time. And there's nothing wrong with that, but we have to remember that if you get an extra decade on the end of your life, you don't get to repeat your 30s. You're into older age, and that's a completely different beast from being in midlife. So we need to think about what it is that we wish for and how will we carry ourselves in our midlife into older age by doing the prep early on of the way we eat and the way we exercise, carry a healthy as possible body into our older age is a gift we can give ourselves. But we
Our
start
future
to
self. That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah, I mean, just when you think about this from a social commentary perspective, we just haven't faced this before. People living to, the ripe old ages of their late 80s and their mid 90s. We hadn't seen this in society at the same scale. So we're figuring it out on the fly, aren't we?
We are. And when I first qualified, when I was a junior hospital doctor, probably a third of deaths were sudden unexpected deaths because people were dying of heart attacks and strokes. And now, because we've got such good early treatment to look after people's blood vessels and keep their diabetes under good control, people are far less likely to have heart attacks or strokes at all. But when they do, they're not of the severity, or we've got treatments that can reverse. It's usually an obstructed blood vessel. We can unobstruct it quickly enough that the heart doesn't fail or the brain damage doesn't happen from those strokes. So it's great that science, that medicine has progressed to stop those sudden, unanticipated, devastating bereavements for families by somebody being well one day and dead the next day. But instead, we're surviving to develop usually a kind of connection of the illnesses of wearing out organs because our organs are as old as we are. And, some of them aren't running that well by the time we're in our 80s and 90s.
Pretty hard thing to accept, but it is a big part of the reality, isn't it? Then we find ourselves with a situation where 70% of deaths are predictable. They can be planned. How do we do? I'm really curious to ask you about, was there a particular moment or event in your life that made you realize, hang on, we are doing this all wrong? Was it a particular moment or was it a sequence of moments that brought you to this work?
That there's a particular family, and it was a family that illustrated something I'd seen many times. But this family, they were my tipping point. So I was working in big, busy teaching hospital. One of the things that we'd done as a palliative care team was a fantastic piece of work with our emergency department, because people are arriving in the emergency department because families had called an ambulance or they stuck somebody in the back of the car and driven like mad up to the hospital. And when people arrive there, some of them are so sick already that it's likely that they're going to die. And it might be that hospital treatment will save them, which means they won't die this time. But of course, we haven't cured death, it's just they won't die this time. But also some of them will die this time. And we need to be able to talk about this person being sick enough to die, having the kind of anti-dying treatments, but also putting treatment in place in case we can't turn it around. So that we're doing parallel treatment to try to sort out this chest infection or heart problem or whatever it is. And also in case we can't stop dying happening, what are the important things we should be doing? Are the right people here? Is there unfinished business that needs to be attended to? Those sorts of things. So we can do that piece of work with our emergency department. And that meant that when they had a particularly challenging situation, they would send the palliative care team to come down and work alongside them to help sort that one out. So we called down to the emergency department for an elderly man who'd just been brought in by ambulance, blue flashing light, with his wife. And he'd collapsed in their kitchen that morning. And the ambulance crew, paramedics, highly skilled professionals, had been giving him cardiopulmonary resuscitation, so pressing on his sternum and pressing to squeeze his heart to get the blood and oxygen that's in his lungs, to keep his brain alive, to keep his kidneys alive for long enough that if there's treatment for the heart problem, he's not too damaged for the treatment to work. And by the time I got there with one of my palliative care nurse colleagues, he'd had a defibrillator put on his chest, that electric shock that sometimes restores the heart to beating again. And what we could see was that the heart was doing its electrical thing again the way it should, but that wasn't translating into squeezing the heart muscle. This heart was just too broken to work anymore, and he was going to die sometime in the next very short few hours.
How old was this person?
So this is part of the story. I got given this set of paper notes because we were just on the cusp of transition to electronic notes. This massive set of notes, and on the top it said volume 3. But there's a tracer card, the very first page, that says this person's history in and out of hospital, different diagnoses. And I could see that he'd been in and out of hospital with increasing frequency for the last 18 months. So that's one of the things that tells us that this person's getting sicker and sicker. And each time we kind of sort them out enough to get them home, they don't manage at home for long enough before they're back in hospital again. So that's a red flag of get ready for the last phase of living, folks. And there were 3 men in this room with him who I assumed were his sons, and a woman who was beside him when he was on the trolley. She was holding his hand, stroking his forehead, whispering in his ear. So we introduced ourselves. They confirmed that they were his sons. So I said, well, I can see that his dad's been really unwell and increasingly often in hospital over the last year or so. What did your dad say he would want to happen if he was ever so sick, that he might die? And they looked at me as though I was speaking Martian. And then they said, oh, we never talked about stuff like that. And then as I was kind of looking in front of us, I realised this man is 97. This man is 97. And these boys, who are his sons, who can't bear that their dad might be dying, they're in their 60s and 70s.
And you're getting volume 3.
And they never talked about it. And yet, then one of them said, actually, Dad did try to talk to me about it last year, and I just told him not to be so orderly. So there's an opportunity missed. And then another one of the sons said, actually, Dad wanted to talk to me about those attorney documents so that Mum wouldn't have to make all of the decisions on her own. And I said that, why don't we do that to celebrate when you turn 100? So clearly this man had been trying to get his family to talk to him about, he's 97, even if he was hale and hearty, he's 97, but he's 97 with lots of bits that aren't working. And then his wife looked up from, consoling her husband and said to these men, lads, you've got to let your dad go. Dad and I have been talking about this for decades. Each of us hoped we'd be the first one to die, so we wouldn't be left without the other. But it looks like he's away. And, it's time to let him go. We have to give him that dignity and that peace now. And so, the decision was the right decision, of course, and we were able to get alongside that. He was looked after in the emergency department because that was one of the things we were trying to stop, people being transferred from the emergency department, dying on a corridor or room
Tracks have been ambulance, sadly, all due common, isn't it?
So I kept this family in my head. I don't know why, but they just lived in my head. And I'm thinking and thinking and thinking. There were so many red flags. There were so many indications that this man was in the last part of living. We can't keep having these conversations about end of life at the bedside of dying. We can't keep delegating that conversation to palliative care staff. By the time the palliative care team meet, you should already have been thinking about those.
Of course.
This shouldn't be a medical conversation. This is a people conversation. And somebody needs to do something about public understanding of dying. This is a national, social, urgent thing. It's not about medicine. It's not about medical care and machineries and intensive care units. It's about what matters most to people, what makes life worth living, and where do I want to live then as part of my life, and how prepared am I to put up with intrusive medical treatment to give me maybe a few extra days or hours, because it's important to me that I survive until a family event happens. Or how much more would I prefer not to have all of that intrusion, even if I didn't live quite so long, to be in the place that matters to me, that makes my heart sing. So I just kept on thinking, somebody has to do something about the public understanding of dying. And I have to tell you, Melissa, it was kind of heart-sink realizations that kind of dripped into my head that, maybe I have enough stories and experience about the way people do live at the very end of their lives that I had a contribution to make to public understanding.
And haven't you just? Kathryn has written a number of books, both they're available in obviously published, written format and also audiobooks, and they are just wonderful, really based on story, but everything you've experienced and learnt and the families that you've seen. So I'd really encourage everybody to have a look at those. Let's talk about those 60-year-old men and their 97-year-old father, because I am really fascinated by the behavioural barriers here. You and I have talked about this on a couple of other occasions, but what do you think's happening in the minds of those adults? How much of that discomfort or willingness to think about the fact that their dad is 97, how much of that is about a lack of understanding or acceptance or hardwired denial? What do you think's going on there?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of layers, probably, isn't it? It's not comfortable to think about dying. It's not comfortable to think about your own. It's possibly even more uncomfortable to think about the death of a person who matters to you, that their absence will change the way your life is. So your spouse, your parents, your children, your best friend, your very precious pet, companion animal, all of those are really important bereavements. And somehow there's a kind of magical thinking that if I don't talk about it, maybe I can avoid it. Or perhaps it's the other way around, and I do talk about it,
It will happen.
I might invite it into the
room. And there's so much loyalty and trust and complexity bound up in those relationships, isn't it? I know when my first husband was really unwell, and objectively I can look back now and know, of course, he was in the last stages of his life, but I felt like I'd be betraying him if I even tried to open that conversation. It's a wicked web of emotion.
It's so hard, isn't it? And it's really hard to think in a balanced and reasoned way when you're in this kind of emotion storm, which is why I think it's hardest for us to talk about the death of the people who are most precious to us. And, I've had these conversations with patients and their families, but I've had these conversations with my own dear friends and my own family, and it's completely different when you love the person. For one of those little red flags about, am I going to upset them? Am I going to make the extended family cross with me for talking about something that's going to be maybe a sad conversation? Or is it going to sow misgivings in this person's mind? Do they think that I know something that they don't know? All of those things. So I think that it's nuanced and it's layered. But I also think, I know, that when you take the lid off and start talking about dying, people are so relieved that it's being named. So although we're reluctant to start the conversation, it's a bit like taking a sticking plaster of a wound and picking at the edges, and then you do the rip. Oh, and is it awkward? Is it difficult? Is it sad? Yes, it's all of those things. Is it loving? Is it important? Is it purposeful? Do you feel that you can explore things that you never realized were important? Did you feel so relieved afterwards? Yes, it's those things too.
We see that all the time, that palpable relief that comes from having the courage to step into those conversations. I want to ask you about the kind of dark side of that scenario or that coin, I guess. In all of your experience, on both emotional and practical terms. What happens when we don't talk about this in advance?
Oh, so those sad rooms of shocked people who suddenly are being asked, if your dad was so sick that he was dying, what would he want us to do now? And those men, those boys, looking at each other and thinking, we ducked this. We had the opportunity and we didn't take it, or we could have created the opportunities and we didn't. We thought we were doing a kindness by not talking about something that made our dad sad or our mum sad. And it turns out they've quietly been chatting about it for decades,
Probably wanting us to open that conversation, waiting for that invitation, isn't it? You talk about.
Yeah. So isn't it interesting to be alongside people who haven't had a chance to get their brains around it? And then I meet other families where they've been talking about it and there's nothing important left unsaid. And I know this is a thing that you talk about a lot, that people are left with regrets when they leave the preparations too late. And that regretful outcome, we can't go back until they try to
Not a dress rehearsal.
That's it. The conversations have been missed. Whereas if we love each other enough, and it is an act of love, love each other enough to start these conversations early, long before there's a suspicion that, the guy with the sign on the hood is in the room. We can start to talk about not dying, but living during the last part of life.
Yeah.
Because my patients, when I was in palliative care practice, while they were labelled as dying, were getting up every day to live a day, to do things that mattered to them.
Very much alive.
Yeah, they were living.
Yeah.
And that's the really important part of this, isn't it? To think about what makes living worthwhile, even as our bodies are finding it harder and harder to do things. What's the most important thing for somebody? What brings them pleasure? What gives their life meaning? Who are their most important relationships? What is it about those relationships that they treasure? Those aren't sad conversations.
No, it's about, how do we make this life stage the best it can be? Going back to your comment on regret and regretful outcomes, I mean, it's a palpable thing, regret. And I think about it for all of the people involved. So for the person who's facing the end of their life, the fact that they never got to articulate where they wanted to be, the type of care they wanted, or the type of care, in fact, they didn't want, and then to be put on that kind of conveyor belt that starts to happen where you feel very disempowered and diminished, and you're kind of on the trajectory of being fixed, in one way or another. There's so much regret in that for that person. And then, as you said, for their family, for their loved ones who have that missed conversation, that missed opportunity for connection and for honesty, and having to bear witness to things playing out in the way nobody wanted, and then having to live with it. There's so much more we could do.
You're right. And it starts with just being able to peel the edge off that conversation, and you'll see whether today could be the day, or this week could be the week, or next time I pop round to your house to see you could be the occasion. Well, we can start to think about some of the things that I might need to know to be your best supporter when that time comes.
Well, let's talk about that, because this is quite honestly a masterclass in conversations and communications around things that are tender and difficult to step into. There is no better person for us to be getting some very practical wisdom and advice. So, Kathryn, we talk about this idea of bringing the conversations back to the kitchen table. Don't leave them until you're in the hospital corridors and everyone is under incredible amounts of stress. Bring them back to the kitchen tables. And for those listening to today's chat, what's your advice? How do they start? Let's go from a very practical place. I mean, you are an absolute master of initiating these conversations and helping us understand how to step through them.
Also, I've had a huge correspondence from people since I started sticking my head above the parapet talking about dying in the last part of life. in the public sphere. And the number of people who said, how we wish we'd talked about it, how we wish that we'd asked, how we wish that we'd known. So I've heard many people regret not having talked about it, but I've never met anybody who regretted having had the conversation.
Great
So I
point.
think maybe the first thing to say is we will feel disinclined to start this conversation, but that disinclination shouldn't be the boss here. That we need to think about those people who feel glad that they had the conversations. We want to be them, and the only way to be them is to start the conversation. But some of the correspondence has been about, I keep trying to talk to my parents about how they want to be looked after, or whether or not they want to go into residential care, or whatever the dynamic is. And they keep shutting me down. And somebody wrote to me and said, if I could just give my dad a really good talking to, I'm sure we can sort into this out. And as I was reading the email, I could almost feel the way her dad would have been backing off, because she loved him, she wanted to sort it, she wanted to make it better, but she was taking control. And I think one of the things we've got to really be aware of is letting the person keep their own control as much as that's possible for them. So rather than going in to give somebody a really good talking to, maybe we need to turn it on its head and think about going in to get somebody really good listening to. And the way that I have found the most useful is to remind people that our older relatives taught us to use a spoon, changed our nappies. And suddenly to have us come in and start parenting in the very way, that's a role reversal that is painful for them. Whereas if we were to go into them and say, okay, Dad, or okay, Auntie Mary, I hold worry that, it's on my mind a lot. I think maybe you could help me with this. You're now entering back into the relationship dynamic of, you are a grown-up who supports me. I may also be a grown-up these days. Then that's the dynamic of our relationship.
And they've got some agency in
So
our conversations.
So I bring this request to you. You've given me powers of attorney. You've made me a substitute decision maker, whatever the jargon is in different parts of the world. And that's a huge thing. But I do worry that when I get asked about some of the things that you might want, if you're not well enough to tell us, I don't know enough to be sure about what's the most important thing to you and what should be the priority. So it would really help me if we could have a conversation about that sometime. Doesn't have to be now, so we're not pushing the agenda. But if we could do it sometime in the next couple of weeks, 10, 15 minutes, not a big, chunky, heavy conversation. And maybe we could do it when you come round to my house before the children come home from school, because it always cheers you up when you see the children when they come in from school. Or, later we could have this conversation over a cup of tea and whilst we like cakes so we can, reward ourselves with what's the treat? What's the exit strategy? So please mainly have the conversation, invitation. You say when, control, and what's the enticement? We will both price ourselves because we recognize that this is a tender conversation, that it may be tricky. In fact, very often when you get down to it, it's less tricky than the expectation. The anticipation can be trickier. The anticipation can be tricky, so can we anticipate a treat as well? And what I'm discovering is when we do that, or we offer and invite and suggest a time frame like the next couple of weeks rather than just any time in the next 10 years, please, you're very easy to avoid. And then we can nudge simply by saying, that conversation I'm hoping to have with you, I'm still worrying about things. I really appreciate your help with it.
Do you mind it takes multiple attempts? Is that kind of a helpful thing to think about if you don't get a positive response, or you maybe get ignored, or is that often the case? You keep kind of nudging?
Well, it varies. And if you think about it like planting a seed, and so you've given them the idea, And it might be that they go waking up, thank goodness, I thought nobody was ever going to bring it up. I'm definitely going to phone her tomorrow and we'll get this sorted. Or they might think, why is she wanting to talk to me about that? I'm not sure I want to talk about those things. But now the seed's been planted, then over the next few days, there will be news items, newspaper items, plots and soap operas. Suddenly, the frailty of being human and the importance of planning ahead, now that the seed has been planting, it pops up everywhere because it's there all the time.
The awareness
Anyway,
is there.
but we ignore it. And so gradually that little seed grows into, oh, you're still going on about that? Yet, okay. Right, how about next week then?
And you talked about tea and cake, and you've given me a sense of some kind of safety in having that conversation. So it might be that bit easier.
And really to set a timer of saying, look, if it gets too much at any point, you say stop. And I'm setting a timer on my phone and we're not going to do this for more than 15 minutes. Now, when the timer goes off for 15 minutes, you might find the process of, thank goodness, that was never do that to me again. But more often, you'll now be in conversation that feels safe and respectful. And they'll say, gosh, is that 15 minutes already? Well, we're in the middle of this now. We'll turn that off. Let's keep talking.
Is it something that we get better with? Like everything in life? Is it one of those things that we build a little bit of confidence and practice in? And if we have to return to the conversation, it's easier?
Well, I think that one of the things is that we're not saying the words for the first time. And that makes it slightly less difficult. But also sometimes we're going to get it wrong. But when we talk about it the next time, you can talk about, do you know what? Last time I promised you that I wouldn't go such and such a place. And now I put my big feet in it, didn't I? And I said that. Oh, I felt so terrible since I did that to you. I'm really sorry. And by now they've processed it too. And they're saying, yeah, well, that was a bit awkward, wasn't it? But I've been thinking about it too. We do really need to talk about it, don't we? So it's like the waves coming up the beach, I think. We shouldn't see it as a single sitting and we'll get all of the things that we want to do.
Yeah, it's not a once and done thing, is it? What about the scenario that probably the one that worries most people is like a really an angry response or a very emotional response? If you were trying to have this conversation with me now, Kathryn, and I shut you down immediately, what would you say to me at that point?
Okay, well, I would assume, first of all, that we were relatives.
Yes,
for very close friends.
let's pretend
And
that.
that's why we'd be having that conversation. So I think I would feel able to say to a close relative or a dear friend, whoa, that's really upset you, hasn't it? I'm so, so sorry. But we feel the strongest about things that really matter, don't we? So I can see today isn't the right day. And let's just leave it. But when you're ready, I'm ready to listen. Don't push it. I'm just happy to listen to what matters most to you, so I don't do it wrong when it really matters. And just leave it. Because very often anger is our kind of outward performance of feeling fight. Of course. So if we push, we're not pushing against it. We're pushing against feeling. That's unkind. Whereas if we actually acknowledge it, I can see this is really, I'm sorry that it's so upsetting for you. I don't want to let you down when the crunch comes, so I need to know when it's not today, and that's fine.
Give it space.
Yeah.
I have loved what you've taught me about the power of silence in conversations. And let me tell you, I think I've been a slightly better parent because of those words of wisdom. Let's talk about that, because silence can make people really uncomfortable. Sometimes we feel like we need to fill a void. But what's actually happening when there's a profound moment of silence in an important conversation?
Well, I think that one of the things I've learned from training medical students, where we video them talking to actual volunteer patients, people are so generous, and they come up and they help us to train the medical students. And the student will be given a task of breaking some unwelcome news or talking about something that's maybe a tricky topic, like sexually transmitted diseases, or breaking unwelcome news about a difficult diagnosis, something like that. And they come out of the video session. This, that silence where I didn't know what to say. And it went on for hours. It was terrible. I bet I failed this assignment. It was awful. And then they debrief with the patient. And the patient says, "What silence?" Okay, so now we watch the video and we see silence that went on for 1,000 years, which lasted about 6 seconds. Yes. Maybe sometimes they've been really able to hold the silence and it's gone on for 10 or even an astonishing 15 seconds. That person, that patient has not noticed the silence because they were so busy in that place, thinking, comparing, making their mind up, changing their mind, wondering about this, remembering about that, bringing stuff together from their past, from the present, the things they're worrying about or wondering about for the future. That silence is incredibly busy for them. It's processing time. And if we interrupt it, they don't do the processing that supports the conversation that we're trying to have with them. So my advice when I'm teaching people about communication skills is, first of all, 2 ears, 1 mouth. Respect that ratio. Listen more than you speak. When you listen, check back that what you thought you heard the person say is what they thought they meant. If I've understood you right, what you just told me is, and then summarize it, because if we offer it back and they say, "Oh no, that isn't what I meant, what I checked," that if it is what they meant, then what they tell us in feedback is, "I felt really listened to," because the person kept telling me what they'd heard and they knew that they were paying attention and they were getting me. So silence as processing time, silence as them thinking, but also silence for you not to feel awkward, because we do call it awkward and ceremony. Call it a thoughtful silence and do your thinking in it as well. What else might we need to talk about? What else might I need to ask about? What are the other things I'm curious about, given what they've sent to me so far? Because actually, this isn't a telling conversation. This is an asking conversation. And if you're being asked questions, you remain in charge of what you say and how you say it. So nobody's taking your power away. And you feel that you've retained your control. You feel you've retained the power. I haven't felt undermined and steamrolled into talking about stuff you didn't want to talk about. You're much less likely to resist the next invitation from that person who comes back a few weeks later to say, "Uncle Elfie, I really enjoyed that conversation I had with you and I learned so much about you and what matters to you and feel so much better now about if the doctors ask me what matters most so that they can, tailor treatments to what matters most to you. I'm much more confident. But there was something that I didn't ask you that I wish I had, or there was something that you said that I've been thinking about and I realised I need to know a bit more about it. Is it okay for me to ask you about that now?" And because you didn't steamroll it last time, because you didn't take the power away, he's far more likely to say, "Okay, what is it?" Even if you else is. It's such a palpable way you've explained it that I have found myself in conversations with my teenagers who I will not name, actually sitting on my hands in those moments of silence, because your point about the kind of shift in power or agency has really felt that. If you jump in too quickly, if you railroad people, they feel diminished, they feel kind of squashed, don't they? And they don't have the time to do that processing and sense making that you've talked about. So I have physically sat on my hands and taken some breaths and counted to 5 and sat with that silence. Yeah. And pretty wonderful stuff has happened because their brains are synthesizing what they need to bring to the conversation. I also think there are some really good ways we can ask questions that, again, give the person power at the same time as giving us the information we might need if we're to be their advocates. What are the usage for? So some things are like, okay, so I wonder. So I wonder is always a great start because it's not I'm telling you.
Mhm.
Yeah, I wonder. I wonder how much you've already thought about this. And so since I never thought about it, and I wish we would think about it now, that's a different tone of conversation from, well, do you know what? Actually, I've been thinking about this for quite a long time. You know, that woman in the emergency department, boys, your dad and I have been talking about this.
We're across
That's yeah. So I wonder how much you've already thought about this. I wonder whether you've got particular things that when you think about towards the end would be the things that matter most to you that you want to make sure that I and the rest of us get right for you. What are the things that you really hope for? How do you really hope you'll be able to be? What will that be like? What will be the good things about you? So these are all questions about what will be good, what will be okay, what will matter. And we couldn't do it quite like. And what would be things that we should bear in mind so it's as close as possible to what you want? I also ask patients, and I haven't tried this in my family, but I guess it will work in my place. Most people I have conversations like this with have a kind of best hope and worst dread. And I'd be really interested to know what your worst dread is and what your best hope is. So no, when the time comes that we're trying to sort things out, we can help it to be the least like your worst dread and the closest we can keep.
Well, that's a great framework. It's really nice.
It's a really great way of helping people to think about their best hope. So I ask about worst dreads first, because that's the kind of damn big conversation. And then remind them that I want you also to know about your best hopes. Because, I can hear that thing that you're worrying about. I can understand why that would be your worst dread. Okay, let's think about your best hope. Let's think about what's the direction we're going to try to move towards for you. And hold that always in front of us, that this is the thing that matters, this is your best hope, this is the most important thing in you. And very often, when you talk to people about that, their best hopes are not about themselves. It's really interesting. It's about how my family will be and how I'll be remembered and whether or not it's going to be a burden for people and how I could cause the least distress to everybody and be the most supportive to them, even though I'm the sick person.
Right.
So it's fascinating how much our relationships come into these conversations. So it's not a practical list of, well, Dad, how do you feel about living in a nursing home? It's much more, if you can't live in this house anymore, despite all the help we want to give you, what do you think the options should be? What have you always thought? And how would you like it to be? What's the least worst option? What's the worst option? And then how do we take it forward from there?
Yeah. How do we think about these conversations within families? Because gosh, every family's got their stories, haven't they? And if they haven't, they're probably not being truthful. But this particular stage of life seems to just pluck the chords of so many deep parts of our relationships and our default responses and the things that make us feel loyal, disloyal. And on the, when you think about the consequences of that, we know that a lot of low value care is actually driven by families not being on the same page, not understanding care goals or not agreeing on care goals. So you get that situation where the son might have flown in from interstate and he has his 95-year-old mum for 2 years, but he wants everything done. Do everything, doctor. And I can only imagine how many times you've seen that. But what does the family do or need to do to avoid that situation? How do you get everyone on the same page?
Oh, such a fantastic question. So I have to start by telling you that the shorthand for that relative from afar who's not on the same page as everybody else in the UK is the daughter from Australia. And what I think it's this family from Queensland in Australia. And
It's the daughter from Australia.
daughter from Australia. And the thing is, because she's so far away, we don't want to worry her because It's hard, it's sad, we love her. And so she's not abreast of all of these conversations. So conversation has been had with the doctor that as mum's health deteriorates, for example, can't inform you resuscitation, CPR, won't be an appropriate treatment for her, or she's going to be protected by having a do not attempt CPR certificate in her notes, and she will carry it with her. And that she doesn't want to be admitted to hospital, but if she absolutely had to, she'd agree, but not to go to an intensive care unit. No longer fit enough to get off a ventilator if she were to be put on a ventilator, so we won't start. So we're starting to put kind of ceilings of intervention in place, kind of parameters. Yeah. Now, they're not ceilings of care. We never stop caring. And in fact, I often think that this very last phase of life sometimes is the most intensively caring. Yeah, that we do. Yeah. But what we're not doing is intervening difficult burdensome treatments. So we're minimizing distress, we're maximizing autonomy and comfort, but we're also trying to help the person to be in the place where they want to be and to be with the person, the people they want to be with. And one of the people they're going to want to be with is that daughter from Australia. So she arrives and she finds that mum is at home. And actually, she's so sick. Surely she should be in hospital. Surely she should be to be taken. Yes. And she hasn't been part of this decision-making process that's allowed the Western family to understand what's going on. So my appeal to our listeners is that we think when we're having these conversations about not just the people who are annoying or party to the conversations, the people who need to understand not just the decisions that have been made, but the reasons, the reasoning behind the decisions that were reached. So they're not completely poleaxed and confused by not enough treatment happening when they arrive from and think, you obviously haven't noticed how sick mum is. Maybe I see it more easily because I don't see it very often. Maybe it's crept upon you because you see her more often. These are all things that I've heard at bedsides from families when they're a local family and family. And it's true in fact, but sometimes it is family from further away who notice the difference. Absolutely. They don't have that incremental. Yeah. So it's really important that we remember to be mutually responsible to each other and for each other's mutual understanding, which again means who's the kinds of information hold in a complicated family is really helpful. If this person who is the holder of all of the information, and what's the information cascade mechanism look like? So I come from quite a big family, and if one of us had to make all the phone calls, it would take them days. Whereas if we have a cascade tree where I and my siblings will each inform our kids who are the grandchildren of our elderly parents, for example, everybody is transmitting information, but we've got an agreed script. This is the information that all the grandchildren need to be given. And then some of those grandchildren who are carrying professions in nursing and medicine, they might have some extra questions to come back with. That's fine. Let's answer those. But let's start off by giving everybody the flavour of what everybody needs to know. And I guess using some of those skills and techniques that you've described about, because they are tender conversations as well. They are bringing people along on the journey of which there is, different levels of understanding and different responses, and there's emotion. So using some of those techniques and those conversation starters that you shared, I imagine would be really helpful when you kind of socialize some of this news with family and friends. And also important to remember that some people will be more ready to process this than others. So it's really helpful if the person who's the most behind the curve, least ready yet to acknowledge that this person's illness is progressing, that they're entering the last part of their living, that person needs to always be the family pace setter. Oh, that's so interesting that nobody else runs on to make other, perhaps irreversible decisions until this person's at least taken a step.
which is not how we normally approach it, is it? We probably move a little more quickly than that without that level of consideration.
Yeah.
That's a really important insight. So you kind of take the temperature of the person that you think has the least amount of knowledge or understanding or readiness or acceptance, and you work to their pace. Kathryn, in your work over the last few years, you've coined this term, ordinary dying. And I heard you speak about it first, I think around the time of the Queen's death. And gosh, it made sense when you think about the age of the Queen and the, hospitalizations that were covered in all of the kind of global media, and the fact that she died a couple of months later. And to me, it just makes so much sense when we again think about an aging population, that these experiences feel so extraordinary in a family when you're going through it. But when we zoom out, ordinary dying, there is a recognizable bodily process that is our bodies getting ready to die. And we're familiar with other processes. What we say when we think about pregnancy is a recognizable process. Labor is a recognizable process. Digestion is a recognizable process. Dying is just another one of those. So one of the things that we notice towards the very end of somebody's life, and it's interesting that it doesn't really matter what the illness or illnesses are, or whether it's even just extreme old age. The thing that we notice is weariness, exhaustion, and increased need for sleep. And sleep is the kind of battery recharge and exhaustion. So I think it's important we say here that this is not your afternoon nap brigade, because I'm a fan of the afternoon salary or this kind of sleeping is not a kind of planned nap. It's the person who just cannot stay awake despite wanting to, and who falls asleep and has another snooze. And then when they wake up, they've got a bit more energy for a while, and then it's almost like you can watch the dial fade on their energy, and again they need another sleep. And then they've got a bit of an energy recharge for a while. And as time goes by, what we find is that people are sleeping more and more and for longer and longer. And they're awake for shorter and shorter times. And that's normal, and that's okay. And we have to plan the things that are important for communication or for pleasure for when they're awake. And it's a bit unpredictable. So that can be a little bit hard. The other thing that can happen, and it's really important families understand it so that they don't feel bewildered by it and frightened by it, is that there can be overlaps between the periods of being asleep and being awake, where the person isn't properly asleep, but they're not properly awake either. And it's a kind of awake dreaming state that we've all had, or never really thought about it. You know, when you've been really, really deeply asleep, and you set an alarm, and the alarm goes off, and you're in deep, deep sleep, and in your dream, the dream starts to include the noise. So there's the burglar alarm goes off, or there's a fire alarm ringing somewhere. And in the dream, you've got to solve whatever this thing is. And then gradually, as you become more and more awake, you realize that, oh no, it's not a fire alarm, it's not a burglar alarm. It's a noise that's in the real world, it's not in the dream, but oh, it's my alarm. And then I can turn the alarm off. But you've had sometimes many seconds, sometimes only a few seconds of being in that sleep-wake state, where things from your subconscious and things from the real world have got muddled up with each other. Yeah. And we call that state delirium. And it can be caused by having very high temperature. It can be caused by chemical imbalances in blood, which are not uncommon towards the very end of life. It can be caused by some medicines. But very often it can just be caused by this dipping in and out of sleep and not quite fully waking up in between times. Now, if we see that happening and we meet it by smiling and by talking in a gentle voice, then the not quite asleep, not quite awake person reads the body language of the warm tone of voice and the smile as things are okay and I'm safe and you look like
everything's okay with you, so things are
Reassured. Yeah.
Whereas if you start to say, well, Mum, no, there's definitely no spiders in the room. Mum, what do you, stop being so silly. Oh, no. They hear the agitation, they hear the contradiction between your experience and their experience. They can't make sense of it. And so what was just a little bit weird now becomes frightening for everybody.
And sound is the last of the senses. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. There's some great research from Canada that shows that even deeply unconscious people approaching death, their brains still respond to sound. Now, we don't know whether they understand the voices of the words that are being spoken in them.
It almost doesn't matter. Because it can bring comfort to everybody there. I have to tell you a little story. A good friend of mine who, I won't name again, but you know who you are. We spoke a couple of weeks ago and her dad had been in and out of hospital and he was back in hospital and she realised that he was dying. He wasn't going to recover. And I sent her your video, which is a beautiful piece called Dying is Not as Bad as You Think. And she said to me, gosh, when you first sent me that, kind of looked at it, I wasn't ready to watch it. But the following day, when my dad was asleep, my sister and I sat in the corridor room and watched it together. And it really helped us understand the following 24 hours. And my dad died at the end of that day. So all of the things you've talked about, the things to make sense of in the way that people's breathing patterns change and their periods of sleep and alertness look very different. We don't know what that looks like. It makes us feel sad, frightened and uncomfortable. But I think with that knowledge, you can sit in that space and it's incredibly comforting.
And it's important, isn't it, that when you think about a midwife helping a pregnant person to be ready for delivery, for labour, they have lessons 10 months or weeks before, so that when you're having delivery day, you're not learning stuff that you've got some tablets.
Yeah. Understanding things may change.
Well, you heard it all before. Your birth partner has heard it all before.
Yeah.
You know that there's a process. You know that there might need to be a plan B and a plan C. But we're signing up for plan A to start.
And there is a plan.
Yeah. So here at the very end of the life, beyond that kind of sleeping, waking period, most people lapse into full unconsciousness. So not asleep. As if you're well enough to be tired enough to need to sleep, you're well enough to wake up again afterwards. Because I meet people who've been told you won't be awake when you're dying, so now they're frightened to go to sleep. Okay, it's not the same as going to sleep. Unconsciousness comes on us without us noticing. Unconscious. And the unconscious brain, as you said, can still hear. And the only other thing it's still doing is regulating breathing. And so we breathe in an unusual way when we're deeply unconscious. And because most of us never see this, because if you're so sick or you're so injured in an accident, that you're deeply unconscious, you usually be in intensive care with a tube in your airway, with a machine breathing for you. So the end of life is the only time we see this breathing. And it's cycles of deep breath that gradually get more and more shallow, and then back to begin. And cycles of fast breathing that gradually get slower and slower, and then it pauses. And so you can imagine that as these cycles pass each other, there can be periods where the breathing is fast when it's shallow. So it looks latched, it looks like it's hard work. It looks like the person might be really working hard to breathe. And if you've never seen it before, you might think this person you love is struggling and is very breathless. They're deeply unconscious. Or it could be slow breathing out through a throat that you can't feel anymore. So you don't know that your breath is coming out through your voice box. And it makes a noise. Well, if you've never heard that before, why would you think this person wasn't groaning or sighing or trying to speak? So again, the midwives of dying need to help prepare people to know that these are the kind of strange breathing patterns and sounds that they'll hear from a person who's deeply, safely unconscious. They're doing the normal process of dying. Yeah, they're doing it absolutely beautifully. Their body knows what to do. This is safe. This is okay. It's sad because it's goodbye. But this person is not suffering. Usually during one of the slow phases, or from when it's shallow and slow, there'll be a breath out. Doesn't have another breath in after it. And that was the last breath. You never see a last breath like that in Hollywood. You people wake up and they say something important that changes the whole plot of the movie. In real life, that isn't what happens. It's very, very gentle. To the extent that very often those of us who work in hands of care can walk into a room where families be sitting all around, in vigil, around their person who's dying. But anything, that person has stopped breathing. And the family haven't noticed yet because the kind of shuddering Hollywood moment, head tilt thing that they're waiting for.
It was a gentle death.
Yeah. So if we know that these sounds tell us that the brain is gradually turning, if we know that that means this person is deeply unconscious and completely safe, we can console each other with that understanding. And one of the first things that happened after I published my first book with the end in mind, which describes this dying process in some detail. And I felt guilty, really, to have told patients stories because I didn't have their permission. And of course, they were dead, so I couldn't get their permission. And I wanted to tell the truth by telling real stories so that people could understand it, kind of observe it with me. I was still feeling anxious and I've broken confidence when I got a message through Facebook. Now, in those days, I just had a mum's Facebook account, which is the way that I knew my teenagers weren't dead. Oh no, that's all I used it for. And I didn't know that there was this way of requesting to send a message to a person you weren't otherwise contacting. So this person sent me a message request and I clicked it, and this message came up that said, "My mum died 8 years ago. I sat with her as she was dying. Her breathing made the most terrible noises. I've never heard anything like it in my life. And I couldn't get the noises out of my head after this. And after 2 years, my GP diagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder and sent me for, and I've been having psychotherapy for 5 years. And yesterday, I read your story in which your boss explained the process of dying to a patient in yours. So it's one of the early stories. And I recognised what had happened to my mum. And I understood for the first time that she'd been completely safe, completely unconscious of all the suffering had happened. And last night I slept through the night. This time. Give me ears. I ought to begin to tell this story. No, by now. But that was the moment in which I thought, you know what? None of those people whose stories I told would resent this. This was the absolute purpose of writing the book, this absolute purpose of campaigning, talking about what's in this process of dying. Because it's so consoling to understand it and observe it in real time and understand all those breathing changes. Or in our bereavement to look back and say, well, that's what happened. That's why it was like that. And that was the first message, but that must have been just before Christmas in 2017. And since then, maybe thousands of messages, all saying, this makes sense to me. This is what I saw. Anybody explain to me? And so we need to be humans, not healthcare professionals, human beings who understand dying, who can remind each other of the process, who can say, yeah, this is normal, this is okay, this is safe, and who also therefore could say, well, that's not okay. That looks uncomfortable. This process should not be uncomfortable. That needs some end. So that people do get good symptom management and rise up to their master. And that is the very essence of your work.
Kathryn, thank you for everything you do, your unwavering commitment to this topic area and issue, your wisdom, your warmth, because you are changing the lives and the experiences of tens, hundreds of thousands of people every year. So I want to acknowledge that. Everything that you're pouring into this is truly, truly gratefully received by so many. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me this afternoon. And I know that everybody listening to today's episode is going to leave with their hearts full of that Dr. Kathryn Mannix warmth and wisdom that is so precious. Thank you, Nurse.